Hello and welcome. My name's Simone Clarke and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for UN Women here in Australia. We're delighted that you could join us today on one of the 16 days to end violence against women, a global campaign which is designated to bring together awareness, advocacy, and hopefully meaningful change to end violence against women. The statistics are all too prevalent, and as a globe, we come together each year to try and end the violence against women. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am joining you from today, joined with my co-host, Julie Inman, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to start by introducing our panellists here today with me. As I mentioned earlier, our co-host today, Julie Inman, who is the Australian Government's eSafety Commissioner. And Julie has an incredible history and knowledge of this space where tech intersects with public policy, with government, with private sector, and has really been a driving force in looking at tech-facilitated gender violence. And it's something we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive today. So thanks for joining us, Julie.
Thank you for having me.
Also online with us are two other incredible champions for women. I'd like firstly to introduce Padma Raman, who joins us from Canberra. Padma is the recently appointed Executive Director for the Office of Women in the federal government and is working towards the first national gender equality strategy for this nation. Not a small task, and again brings a wealth of knowledge from her former role in ANROS, the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety. So Padma, again, thanks for joining us today here on this panel.
Great to be here.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Ball. Dr. Catherine is a futurist, a scientist, a technologist, and is not afraid to call out what's hidden and lurking behind technology, but also with a hopeful view that the way that we approach it can actually change the way women live their lives. So, Dr. Catherine, great to see you again, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Based on those introductions, we're now going to get straight into the topic for today's session. And I think it's a really interesting session. And if you've read the blurb about what we're going to talk about today, the title for today's session is Dystopia to Deepfakes, when the stuff of science fiction is weaponized against women. And unfortunately, we know that there are a number of examples about this, and we're really going to call on the experts here with me today to delve a little deeper into what the challenges are for us as women, but also as a community and a country, and to explore some of the myths and the biases that exist that are not only in the real world, but also transitioning to and being reproduced and drawn on in the virtual world, and particularly in the world of AI, which I know there's a lot of conversations about at the moment. So I might, if you don't mind, panelists, I might start with you, Padma. Padma is joining us from Canberra, as I understand. Padma, given your experience, interest to explore a little bit more with you around the online hate and misogyny and the perpetration of that, and how gender, race all intersect online. So could you tell us a little bit more about that in terms of your background and the research that you've undertaken in the past?
Thank you. Well, we know that the online world has become the new frontier for abuse, gender-based violence and abuse of women. If we think about the online world as being an extension of the physical world, which it is, with some notions of anonymity when you're on it, it has led to a much greater use of online platforms for abuse and targeting of women. We know women are more likely to be the targets of abuse, and they're overwhelmingly the targets of image-based abuse. And we know that technology is used to tech-facilitated abuse. So an abusive relationship can also use technology to maintain coercive control over their partner, to continue to harass them. We've even seen it in areas like banking, where internet banking has been used to harass, intimidate, and threaten partners with 1 cent transactions, for example. So I think we need to be really aware also of the intersections between race and gender. We've seen there's research that has been done that shows that migrant women and women from First Nations communities are particularly susceptible to racialized gender-based violence. And we also know that with migrant women, for example, access to technology is often their connection back to community and family, and perpetrators can often take away access to that connection. So it can be used in many, many different ways, both in terms of controlling and manipulating your partner, keeping them in fear, but also as a platform where it's used both for intimate partner violence, but also more broad scale targeting and abuse of women. We know that there was a study done in 2015 of women who were working in the media who found that 55% of them had experienced cyberbullying, cyberstalking, and trolling on social media. So we're not just seeing, we're seeing women being far more susceptible to abuse online, and we're hearing that's why women don't even want to go for political representation, for example, because they're targeted and face a deluge of abuse. I know Julie knows a whole lot about this, so might even flick over to her to expand on what you're seeing as the eSafety Commissioner and as the regulator in the space.
Oh, thanks, Padma. I think you did an amazing job. But just really to reemphasize, of course, we know that technology can be used as a tool or a weapon. But unfortunately, the way that technology can be weaponized against women really does further entrench gender inequality, and it plays upon lingering gender double standards. So in all of the forms of regulatory schemes that we have, from youth-based cyberbullying to image-based abuse to adult cyber abuse, even child sexual abuse material, women and girls are far more likely, anywhere between 76% and 95% of the targets that are reported to us in terms of abuse. But it's also important to understand how online abuse or misogynistic abuse targeting women manifests differently. It tends to be violent. It talks about rape, killing of children, your appearance, your supposed virtue. All of these things, it's like the scarlet letter of the digital age. If a guy is showing off his six-pack, he's big noted, but women are still seen to be one of ill repute. And that's why deepfake porn can be such a potent weapon against women. I think we're also talking about a spectrum of harm. So at the pointy end, we're all working around technology-facilitated global gender-based violence in terms of women who are experiencing family and domestic violence. We know that in 99% of cases, technology-facilitated abuse is an extension of that. That does translate into some of the reports of abuse that we see. The vast majority of adult cyber abuse cases that we're actioning involve cyber stalking or doxing of a former or current intimate partner, and are at the very high end of that scale. We also have to remember how this is used in more diffuse and attenuated ways, whether through deep fakes or through what we would call a sustained gender trolling or gender disinformation, to undermine women in the public eye by questioning their competence, undermining their confidence, causing them to self-censor or leave public life altogether. And we've got to remember 2024 will be the biggest year ever in terms of elections. And we really need to be vigilant that this kind of attenuated and diffuse abuse can be used to undermine women. I mean, 39% of parliamentarians in Australia are female, but when you look across the world, the average is about 26%. If we really want representative parliamentary democracies, we need to see more women and more women of color and from diverse backgrounds in these major fields.
Couldn't agree more, Julie. I might just pick up on something that was a thread that carried through, and a question for you, Dr. Kath. I know we've had some interesting and almost and shocking conversations around deep fakes and the impact that they can have on women. Can you talk a little bit more about that for those who probably aren't as familiar with what that actually means and some of the examples that you have seen for those who are listening?
Yes, and I'd actually already direct people back to the work of the eSafety Commission. So if you're not already signed up to the newsletters and the reports that come out of Julie's office, particularly as a parent, there's a swathe of resources that are accessible to everybody, whether you're a parent or not, around different kinds of safety, around different apps and what some of these terminologies mean and what some of the legal cases might be that come from this. that with every new technology, the idea of regulating it is almost like the horse is bolted, right? We just can't regulate these things fast enough. We have to look at pseudo legislation, insurance, assurance, or other types of criminal code that might already exist that we can possibly apply to this whilst we develop the codes. I'd like to start seeing some prescience in how we start trying to protect against what we know is coming next. For me, Bletchley Park, in the meeting that Rishi Sunak held there, one of the first things they talked about was this idea of watermarking. It was also mentioned in Biden's executive order. So what is a deep fake? A deep fake, you may have seen, used in a funny way on social media, because there's a deep fake Keanu Reeves and a deep fake Tom Cruise, and they make very amusing little silly Instagram and TikTok videos, and it's very funny, and it's obvious it's fake because it's actually not that good. But everyone also might remember the picture of the Pope dressed in the fake white puffer jacket, and also some wildlife photography competition photos where you have to guess which one's the real photograph and which is not. And the AI is only going to get better with images and videos and audio over time. So the idea is that you can create really realistic, hyper-realistic imagery and video and audio of you, of me, of Santa Claus, of Keanu Reeves, of Joe Biden, of Albanese, of anyone you want, be it a school teacher, or maybe you're a school kid and you're doing it of somebody you're at school with. And it can look like it's the real deal, and it can look like it's the real thing. The big push for this idea of watermarking is to try and allow the creatives some space to verify that where they've created deepfakes, they go stamp verified. And in fact, verified, I thought was going to be one of the words of the year this year. Maybe verified will be a word of the year for 2024, because the tech industry is not silly about this. They recognize, and Rishi Sunak recognizes, that for every technology and all of the ecosystem and all of the economy and the money that that brings, there is the anti-tech ecosystem, which sometimes has more money, more weight behind it, more moral fiber to it, some might suggest. And so when you have this issue of the deep fakes being produced that may be pornographic images or video, or even audio of people making threats or comments, then you want to prove what is real and what is fake. Now, the problem is, I have to say, humans, in that but the solution is also humans, in that even if you put up on LinkedIn, this is a fake video, some people will still think that it's real. Because people don't see what they see what they want to see. And this is the problem with the modern data in, data out social media age. So I think what Bletchley Park really was meant for with the British government was to try and provide an economic boost to some of these counter technologies, to say, we know what's coming. We know some countries that won't sign up for best practice. So let's police this. And there's money in policing, because as parents and as socially responsible governments, we will put the doors and the locks onto some of these types of technologies unless they can be proven to be able to be safely regulated, even if not by the companies that are hosting them, by the companies that are producing them, or even the ways in which we're accessing them as an end user. There have been some horrific cases of deepfakes, specifically around pornography. And if you think about deepfakes, 80% of deepfake video, I believe, was about, I think it's 80%, Julie probably knows the actual statistic. The urban legend is that about 80% of deepfakes is purely pornography. Now, imagine that you've already got school kids making deepfake pornography of other school kids, of teachers, of parents. You know, the damage psychologically to young people's mental health from seeing this kind of image-based abuse. I don't think we have fully come to reckon, actually, even the danger to young people's mental health just from standard AI filters and beauty filters on social media. So that's a reasonably long answer there, Simone, for a reasonably difficult question to answer, because what is a deep fake? Well, can you tell the difference between a deep fake and a real person? Am I actually a real person talking to you? Am I a really good AI deep fake version of me? How do you prove it?
Thanks, Catherine. I think it calls out certainly the pervasive nature of deep fakes, and certainly the implications for children right through to adults and the community more broadly. And the conversation today really around how we look to end or control, or at least address, tech-facilitated gender-based violence. Padma, I might just come back to you. I know that the Australian federal government is working on and developing a national gender equality strategy. I know that part of the lens that you were looking at is, the role that technology plays in exacerbating and continuing to marginalise women, if you like, and certainly in some cases enhance violence against women. So I'm keen to understand from a government perspective what your thoughts are around tech-facilitated gender-based violence and/or the role that tech can play also in addressing some of the challenges that we face as a country.
Yes, so we are working on the first gender equality strategy for Australia, a national strategy, which we hope to release early next year. But the strategy builds on work that the government's already done. So the government did release last year the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. That plan clearly recognises the place of tech-facilitated abuse, recognises it as an area that is increasingly dangerous for women, and also an area that is very, very difficult to regulate and very, very difficult to control from a government perspective. But that plan, the National Plan to End Violence Against Women, also recognises the importance of us working with men and boys to really talk through these issues, to bring them along in the journey, rather than just seeing them as perpetrators, but recognizing that they can be perpetrators, but also recognizing that they have an important role to play in ending violence against women and children. So the National Strategy for Gender Equality builds on existing government strategies. So the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, there's a National Health Strategy, and it also takes into account the recommendations of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, which once again talks about the gaps. There is a very strong link between women's economic inequality and the experience of violence that they experience. And again, when you think about technology or online platforms being an extension of what happens in the physical world, we can't lose sight of that. Even when we're thinking about how Australians meet each other, surprisingly, most people these days meet each other on dating apps. And research from the Institute of Criminology shows that 3 out of 4 women who use dating apps have experienced harassment in that process. So I think what we are recognising in our government strategies are the importance of this new and emerging field, but also recognizing how difficult they are to, as Dr. Kath said, we are behind the 8 ball in terms of regulating it. As a lawyer, I'll tell you that law is always slow to respond to human problems, leave alone technological problems. So, we are catching up. And I guess it's really important to have frameworks like a national strategy that at least tells you what the government's aim is for gender equality. And the government is very clear that gender is going to form the basis of every policy decision. So a sort of focus on how does a new policy affect gender, both men and women, and people who might not identify as either, but having that lens around what does it mean? What is the impact of government policy and government action on different cohorts of people, and having a really people-centric approach. And while we were doing the strategy, we were also looking at women's economic participation. And one of the things that the Women's Economic Equality Task Force found was the Australian economy is losing $128 billion a year by not engaging women in the economy. And when you're thinking about the tech sector in particular, the rates of women in the tech sector are so low that we should almost expect that the AI that comes from that industry is not going to have the gender sensitive gender sensitive principles and the safety by design principles that Julie's office has so helpfully come up with as part of the way they think about the technology. So I think there is a piece around talking about the segregation of workforce and how few jobs. I think it's 7.5% of AI researchers in Australia are women, for example. So that speaks to a broader problem of how women are represented in the industry as well. And again, that was a very long answer to a very specific question, and I went down lots of rabbit holes.
There's a lot to cover. There's a lot of content there. Thanks, Padma. Julie, I think I'm really interested to hear, and I'm sure that people who have joined us here today are really interested to hear about your work. You've been a global leader, and you've been really leading the charge around this notion and this practice of safety by design and what that mindset actually looks like. Can you talk a little bit more about that and perhaps some examples? Because I think it's, it's a very pragmatic approach to how you can incorporate safety by design into product development, the way we approach. But over to you. I'd like to hear more about it.
Right. Well, as you noted, I spent 22 years in the tech sector myself, and I want to thank Salesforce, by the way, for hosting us. We are being hosted by the tech sector here. And I tried to bring safety by design to one of my former employers. I was sitting in product reviews where we were looking for potential security vulnerabilities and privacy breaches, but I said, hey, what about personal harms? At that time, the company was much more focused on the enterprise, but I was fortuitous enough to land in this role as eSafety Commissioner. And what the initial Online Safety Act sort of established for the eSafety Office was to be the regulator, to be given regulatory tools for protection. We were also designated the educator and coordinator, so that's where the prevention piece came in. But there was no mention of what I call proactive or systemic change. So how do we become an anticipatory regulator? How do we know what's coming down the track 18 months to 2 years? Because of course we know that technology is always going to outpace policy. How do we minimize the threat surface for the future? And how do we put more of the onus or responsibility on the platforms themselves? So safety by design fit into that. But so did the work that we did around tech trends and challenges. And ironically, about 2 years ago, our first tech trends brief was around deepfakes. We could not get the mainstream media to pick up a story about deepfakes. It was just a little bit too early. And I have to credit the generative AI revolution that we've seen hit us at 2023 to have countries around the globe say, ooh, well, actually, we need to learn the lessons from Web 2.0 and social media. We need to get ahead of this. We need to think about, we want to stimulate innovation and investment and create economic opportunities and growth, but we can't let it be growth at all costs without thinking about the impacts on humans and humanity in general. So safety by design fits in all of those contexts. And the best sort of real world analogy I give is seatbelts. 60 years ago, I remember sitting in the front bench of my the family station, wood panel station wagon. There was a little sticker on the back with the dog smiling saying, "Don't eat yellow snow." So that was a little bit of a diversion. But you remember those things. And we would ride in the front seat without any seatbelt whatsoever. It wasn't until Ralph Nader, a young lawyer at the time and consumer advocate, that wrote Unsafe at Any Speed and showed the data. If seatbelts are embedded, traffic fatalities will, decrease massively, and they did. But the car manufacturers at the time pushed back. They didn't want to have to invest in safety. Today, we get into our cars and we take for granted that there are seatbelts and anti-lock brakes and airbags that will deploy when something goes wrong. All of these things are built in by design, and companies in the auto industry actually compete on safety standards. The technology industry haven't had any of these requirements. So safety by design, the whole idea is that companies themselves will assess the risks, they will understand the harms, they will build the protections in at the front end rather than retrofitting after the damage has been done. And why I think AI has helped, I used to say things like, we need to, embed digital guardrails and virtual seatbelts, and people would look at me quizzically. Now everybody's talking about building in safety, and they're talking about guardrails, because if we let all this technology be extricated out into the wild without security, safety, and privacy protections up and down this very complicated stack, it's going to go beyond whack-a-mole and racket-roll, as we discussed last time we were here at Salesforce. So we need to have that regulatory scrutiny really be at the design phase. We need to know how companies are identifying data, how they're training that data, all the way through the model and throughout the system.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I think the idea of some seatbelts around tech might be a good thing, albeit in terms of, I think, things and considerations we all have around safety, privacy, and also gender violence and tech-facilitated gender violence. So I might just take us off on a slightly different track with you, Dr. Kath, just to talk a little bit more about AI. There's a lot of conversations around it. I think there's varying degrees of understanding around it, but I'm really interested to hear more from you around the ideas that the existing biases in the real world are now through AI being translated to the virtual world, and the data points that are being drawn on are those data points which actually we see in the real world, and unfortunately those data points aren't exactly enabling nor something to be proud of. So I'm interested, though I know that you've worked a lot in this space, if you can just talk a little bit more about AI and how you see it, because I think we often also talk about tech with one lens, but I think there's also some great opportunities that you often speak about as well. So keen to understand a bit more about the world of AI and what that actually means for women in particular.
Yeah, well, just really to talk about the scalability of some of these technologies too. So if we think about the seatbelt analogy, it's only even in recent years that women-shaped crash dummies have even been invented. So most seatbelts were invented for a male body, which means women are less likely to survive a car accident than men. So if we think about AI in the same idea of seatbelts, but seatbelts designed by who and for who, and so artificial intelligence, but designed by who and for who. And when we think about some of the technology hiccups around representation of all genders, and also representation, this might be a slight one, I'll give you an example of the COVID Safe app, which I believe when they first opened the code up to the coding community, in the first draft of the COVID Safe app, the code was missing the entire state of Tasmania, and it was designed by people that obviously didn't know Tasmania, otherwise Tasmania would have obviously been in the list. Then if you think about how your Apple device will have a health function on it, you count your steps, you put your calories in, but one thing it did not have as a native part of that app for many, many years was the idea of a period tracker. And, only 51% of the world's population menstruates, only half. And so obviously, again, the people that built that native app, and it went all the way through all of the design phases and all of the safety phases, not a single person stopped and said, hang on a sec, we're missing basically the oldest kind of health measurement that humans have ever done. And wonderful Sandy Toksvig from the UK, she once talked about this bone that was found in Scandinavia. It was on display in a museum that had 28 notches on it. And you might think I'm going off on a tangent here, but this is how artificial intelligence is being built. Imagine you've got a bone with 28 notches on it, and you've got to put a bunch of people there will sit and go, wow, look at this bone. Okay, we know it's a few thousand years old. What on earth would you want 28 notches on a bone for? What could you possibly want 28 notches for? Anyone? And so, the tea lady probably in the room would have probably said to the men around the table, I'm doing an allegory here now, periods, menstrual cycle, and so where and when the things for me now, with artificial intelligence, the way it's scaling and how it's pulling data and information into the libraries that it's using to create. For example, this is talking about generative AI now. So generative AI is sucking information in. Its copyright law is going to have a right conniption about all of this. Sucking all of this information in, and then it tries to give you an answer that it thinks is the correct answer. And we're already anthropomorphizing complex mathematics by using terms like, oh, it's hallucinating. It's coming up with the wrong thing because it's hallucinated. Has anyone put themselves into ChatGPT and said, who is Dr. Kath? Well, I'm apparently a CEO of a data company in the UK, so I'm like, is this prescient? Should I be doing this? Is this on my career path? A colleague of mine put his name in, had his own personal Alfred Nobel moment, and got an obituary. And so again, the machines won't care about you, mate, because they already think you're dead. So it's like, when we build these libraries, effectively what they're doing is they're pulling on huge swathes of information and data, and they're using really advanced mathematics to try and get you something that sounds like it's about right. But I have a real problem with the term artificial intelligence. And this might sound like semantics, but there's something around humans that we like to delegate our authority to something other than us that we don't quite understand when it comes to things like artificial intelligence. It's not artificial. there are people that have been priming these machines, testing these algorithms, and people that are still paid really, not very good wages and not very good working conditions to actually help grow some of these companies' technology products. I'm just going to put that to one side. Anyone who cares about ESG and corporate social responsibility, the stock exchanges should be paying attention to this in terms of any ASX registered company around Modern Slavery Act, for example. Then you've got this idea of intelligence, because it sounds like it's human. AI is not that intelligent in terms of the generative AI, in that it makes mistakes and it's still guessing and it's still learning. The point is ChatGPT is only a year old, though it feels like it's been here for a long time. And that's because the terms around artificial intelligence in our modern Western lexicon have been around for nearly 100 years. I mean, it was Ada Lovelace back 170 years ago, as a woman in technology, came up with this idea of living in virtual worlds. It was Ada Lovelace that first thought of this idea of living in a metaverse. I mean, that was 170 years ago that we've been having these conversations. It's just now that the technology is getting ready for it. But there are many different types of advanced mathematics. There's many different types of things that people would coin the term of artificial intelligence. When and how they scale, for me, is less interesting than where. Where are they scaling and what are they being used for? Now, I like the term converge because I wrote a book called it, but the idea of converging different types of technology alongside these advanced mathematical capabilities is where I get excited but also terrified. Because when we think about human rights abuses using facial recognition, for example, and the mass management of the populace, particularly women in countries that aren't particularly I'd say aligned with my values around the treatment of women, and the idea that there will be facial recognition and AI-based cameras potentially looking to see if someone's headscarf is on or off and whether the morality police might find them, for example. I start going into a dystopian quagmire that it's too big a problem for me to have the knowledge to be able to start to deal with. But I do feel like as Australians, because we have a position around the table globally, we should grasp the nettle and start asking these kinds of difficult questions at a diplomatic level in the United Nations, groups that talk about women and women's safety and the role for women in society. And that will not be a friendly conversation. So when you converge AI, for example, and deep mathematics and machine learning with things like personalized medicine, having a doctor being able to have more accurate results from mammograms for breast cancer seems like a no-brainer. As long as, and IBM wrote this on a sheet of paper in the meeting rooms in 1979, a machine cannot be allowed to make a decision because a machine cannot be held accountable for that decision. And this leads me to my final point on AI, is that when we look at our governance processes in Australia, we look at the global way in which our economies are being managed, when we look at all of the new and emerging technologies that are now converging, diverging, forming different pathways and scaling at different rates, what is our level of technical literacy at the highest echelons of politics and business and governance? And I feel like we have a diversity red flag, not only around gender, but also around STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths at every single level of governance and politics across the world and also here in Australia. And that is not going to be an easy conversation for us to deal with.
Thanks, Catherine. Again, lots to think about in that space. And I think you alluded to what we are possibly all facing into, which is being coined a digital collision course. And so what actually will happen when AI, decentralisation and immersive tech actually converge? And so, Julie, I'm just interested on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, we dabbled in the metaverse. I think it's still going to happen, maybe not as quickly as we thought. It was leapfrogged by, I think, the arrival of generative AI, and it caught a lot of people flat-footed. But what we've been saying about immersive technologies for a long time, when you have full sensory haptic suits, and there are actually people working on haptics that will simulate the feeling of a bullet wound for when you're playing violent interactive games. There are, of course, going to be intimate and sexual manifestations of haptics. There's already a whole industry around teledildonics, so, connected sex toys. And you're going to be in a virtual reality, so it's high sensory, it's hyper realistic. When you are a young child in a private space and someone assaults you, it's going to feel very extreme, very visceral, and very real. And then you start thinking about the developments in what I call invasive technologies, neurotechnologies, quantum technologies that could have tremendous health and medical benefits. But we're talking about sticking chips in our brains and injecting little particles to, kill the white blood cells in our veins. If we don't have safety by design perfected by that time, I mean, the report abuse functionality that we use today is not going to work in a real-time scenario for the metaverse. So you think about how, I mean, even 2 or 3 years ago, to generate imagery required thousands of images of an individual, which is why celebrities tended to be the first sort of deep fake people. But it also required tremendous amounts of computing power. And now you have a smartphone, a consumer-facing app where you've got Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, DALL-E, any of these things that are getting into the hands of school children, that are getting into the hands of people who will creatively misuse technology. I mean, we're even seeing organized criminals using voice cloning technology. I think most of us are now aware of Hey Mom. The potential manipulation capability of chatbots in terms of sexual extortion and grooming at scale and in real time is really, really scary. So if we don't get ahead of this now and start putting, again, the responsibility back on the platforms up and down the stack, not just the developers, but those who are hosting open source AI models, for instance, and this is what some of our standards that are out for public consultation will tackle at the moment. I mean, we know there are lots of positive use cases for AI as well. And in terms of illegal content detection, I'm excited about the possibilities. So we're never going to have a static environment. But when you put immersive, invasive, generative AI, and then you put decentralization, where everything is diffuse and decentralized, and no one takes responsibility. We're not talking about traditional notice and takedown. How do we actually make people, make corporations? We'll never make technologies responsible for things. It is the people that weaponize that technology. But we're on a scary collision course, and it's time for governments to get together and put our collective heads around this now. With all due respect to Prime Minister Sunak, a lot of this work has been going on for a long time, even in the context of the G7. The Hiroshima Principles came out, of course, the executive order. Our own government is looking at safe and responsible AI framework, and I think they're in the midst of the consultation, but they're looking at this now. I'd also say, had we not taken that anticipatory lens and started thinking about how deep fakes might manifest in negative ways, deep fakes would not be covered in the Online Safety Act of 2021. We needed to make sure that it did. And there is a guy sitting in a Queensland jail right now who was creating deep fakes of prominent women in Australian society. And thankfully, both law enforcement and eSafety have powers in that area. We are seeing children weaponizing these technologies to create sexualized videos of their classmates. But as Catherine pointed out, the antidotes to the poisons or the medicines, whatever you want to call them, always lags behind. So the deep fake detection tools are way behind, and watermarking might go some way. There's a content authenticity initiative that a number of companies are working on as standard. But again, we need to keep ahead of that arms race and make sure that we're thinking about other ways to be able to validate what's happening. I mean, these types of images of people doing insane things they may not actually be seeing and doing, if you can't tell by the naked eye or by the ear that these are fake, it can become true because things go viral so rapidly. And by the time you validate that the damage has been done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that plays into a conversation around, the global nature of technology. And that might seem obvious, but I think we've spoken a little bit today about what it looks like in Australia, some of the things that are happening in the UK. But I think in terms of global collaboration, are you seeing much sort of global collaboration consistency. I know recently there was a whole conversation around addressing the risk, because if we apply a risk lens, that's really what gets people and corporations' attention. So I'm keen to understand if there's been, if you're seeing many global initiatives or collaboration which is really bringing together countries, disciplines and others to really try and drive change in this space?
Absolutely. We're seeing a lot more change in this space. There is the Global Partnership to Combat Technology-Facilitated Abuse and Harassment that was started by the White House in the US and Denmark at the Freedom or Democracy Summit. Australia was one of the first companies to join on, and I'm the representative for Australia on that group. There are about 14 countries now. Last year, we also launched the Global Online Safety Regulators Network with the UK, Ireland, and Fiji. And since that time, we've added South Africa, we're adding France, and South Korea as online safety regulators. With the Digital Services Act in the EU, by February of next year, all 27 states will have a designated digital services accountable agency. So again, I think the rapid emergence of generative AI has put this on the attention of governments around the world. I don't think we'll have a similar eSafety office in the US, but they're looking at legislation like COSA, and Senator Schumer has set up a bunch of AI roundtables. So I think energy is peaking in the right way. We just need to make sure that we don't panic, and that the policy making that we're doing is not in response to that panic, but is really thoughtful and mindful. And what we're trying to do through this global network is ensure that we're sharing best practices, because we were the first agency established 8 years ago. We've got a little bit of a playbook, and we need to work together. We're never going to have, I think, perfect synergies or perfect, but we want to aim towards more cohesion in terms of what these global regulatory frameworks look like.
Yeah. And as someone that's observed the work of the eSafety Commission and your work in particular, I think you should be really proud of a lot of the gains and the programs and initiatives that have come to light, and really through cross-sector collaboration, some of the work with banks, with telcos, with others. I think that the work of the eSafety Commission is absolutely integral to helping us think about these things and getting ahead of the train, or strapping on the seatbelt, whatever that might be. So I just want to change tact a little bit now as we go into the final stage of our conversation today, because I know that we've focused a lot on the risks, the harms, but as someone that likes to look with hope on the horizon, I think it'd be really nice to hear from each of you around, what do you hope for the future? What are the things that you see, the enabling technologies? Where are the positives in this? Because there are many, and I think we do tend to focus a lot on the negatives. But I'd be interested to hear from you. What gives you hope for the future around some of these technologies?
Well, I'd like to see safety by design to become that operational mindset where companies are thinking about risks, they are understanding harms, and they're building in the protections like that. When I was working in trust and safety, I was referred to as a cost center, or it was looked at as a friction point. I would love for companies to think about this as in their business interests. They're preventing misuse of their technology. They're preventing toxic experiences from happening to people, and they can use innovation and investment to be able to really leapfrog and create safer, more positive experiences online. That's what I'd like to see.
Great. There's a statement of hope if ever I've heard one. Padma, I'd like to just ask you for, we are drawing to the close, but I'm really interested in where you see the intersection with technology, and certainly around gender equality and the Office for Women's. Just interested in how you see that on your horizon in terms of the work that you do, and also perhaps with a measure of hope for the future in terms of the Australian government's work. So keen to hear from you, Padma.
Well, I mean, I think, the discussions we've been having about the positives, just imagine if AI actually was used to reduce gender bias in decision making, for example, which it can. And if it actually helped us in terms of facilitating work-life balance through automation, rather than just automating the functions that women do traditionally. There's a huge amount of scope for technology to bring about gender equality. But at the moment, it's not at that place yet, but we have to be vigilant around that. And I wanted to say there is a growing recognition in governments, not just with the constant updating of the eSafety Commission and being conscious of what's coming down the track. There's also a meeting of ministers who deal with online harm, for example. So there's this sense that it touches many different parts of government, and that there needs to be a coordinated approach for us to be able to stay ahead of it. And I think the biggest part of this is actually to educate people about what's out there. I know that's scary, but I think empowering people and women especially to understand the potential of the technology, both in negative terms but also in positive terms, will really be beneficial to our community and gender equality more broadly.
Thanks, Padma. And I'd like just a comment too, I think, from Catherine. I know we've had quite a few conversations about this in terms of the impact and the opportunity for a more gender equal future, and certainly the impact on women. So I'm keen to hear from you around some of your hopes and aspirations as someone who lives and breathes the future every day of your life. So a word from you, Catherine, on that.
So 3 technology ecosystems that I think are really going to be very important in the next 18 to 24 months are on 3 different scales, and each of these actually have a gender bias or a gender lens on them. So the first one, actually, I want you to think of the smallest thing you can possibly think of, the atom, and let's go quantum. Now, when you put artificial intelligence in bed with quantum and it makes babies, what on earth can we possibly do? Well, nuclear fusion, free energy, is going to happen in our lifetime. Some people are putting bets on this by the end of the decade. Now, why does that affect women? Because women are directly, disproportionately affected by energy poverty. Let's go up one level in terms of scale now, and let's look at synthetic biology and personalized medicine. In 1993, legislation was passed that said that women had to be included in drug trials. Even now, women are being given the wrong dose of medicines because they were never involved in the drug trials. And so the very idea that we can have personalized medicine to ourselves means we're going to be able to remove some of that historical bias against women as we look at personalizing our solutions. And also understanding our immune systems better. Women are disproportionately affected by autoimmune conditions, rare diseases, and everything around reproductive rights and reproduction and how all of that's going to work. Synthetic biology and artificial intelligence is going to be the go there. And then let's go up on a planetary scale and let's look at this idea of Gaia, the goddess of planet Earth, and all of the issues around climate change. And here we have a double-edged sword when it comes to artificial intelligence. One side, we know that the carbon footprint of this technology is absolutely massive, and the water footprint, the environmental impacts of artificial intelligence-based generative AI searches. If you turned every Google search into a Bard search, they would blow all of their carbon targets at Google. They don't want everyone using generative AI when a Google search will do, and there'll be an education piece to play there. But juxtapose that with the fact that we are now looking, and even people like NASA are working on this idea of a digital twin of planet Earth. How are we supposed to be able to take the smallest sensor measurements from the deepest parts of the ocean, where we have 95% of our all living life is in the deep ocean? How do we protect the deep ocean from deep sea mining, for example, and understand the value that some of these unmapped areas actually bring to us as humans as part of the biosphere on this beautiful blue marble? Well, one way we'll be able to do that is by quantifying it using better mapping and Earth observation technologies and techniques by creating digital twins of planet Earth, which we will need the mathematical capabilities of artificial intelligence. And why does this disproportionately affect women? We know that climate change disproportionately affects women, and women really, when you give them the power to look after Mother Nature works very well with her daughters.
Great, thanks, Dr. Catherine. A lot to think about there, and global twinning scares the hell out of me, if I'm really honest. But as you know, I'm not a technologist nor a futurist, but I am always open to the opportunity. I think from a UN Women perspective, our position and approach really is around the fundamental human rights, and whether it's technology or whether it's the environment, the economy, all of the things that we need to work on as a community to make the world a safer, fairer place for women to survive and thrive is a really important conversation, not only today and within these 16 days of activism against things like tech-enabled violence, but 365 days a year. So I'd encourage everyone to keep thinking about it. And I'm just delighted and wanted to thank our panelists here today and my wonderful co-host for hosting us, as well as for Salesforce, for opening up this wonderful space for us to be able to join you from, because technology is, I think, at the heart of the opportunity for us all as a planet And the more we work together and we are ahead of, or at least looking for the things that challenge us and the things that might, unbeknownst to us now, be coming down the track, I think we're in really safe hands, certainly with these amazing women that I had the privilege to speak to today with. So thank you for joining us. I'll bring us to a wrap. I know that people are going off to lunch breaks, if not already. So again, thank you for your time. And let me just put one challenge out to all of you, is that let's turn our 16 days of activism into 365 days of action. Thank you for your time.